Today's a really interesting topic, actually, something that's very close to my heart. Looking at ideas and looking at the history of ideas, looking at where do they come from? Are they really new? Are they really as novel as we think they are? And when we're diving into this, before we do this, I want you to answer one question. I want you to write in the comment section. What I'd love for you to answer is, when was the last time you had an idea and realized someone had already done it before? Or, second thing, when was the last time you had an idea and then realized that there was something that sparked it from a year, couple of years, maybe even 10 years ago? And so today I'm joined by author and writer at The Guardian. His name is Steven Poole, and he's here with me live in the studio. So Steven, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great to be here. And you're the author of this fantastic new book called The Surprising History of New Ideas, Rethink. And we're going to drop the link from Amazon into the comment section. So if you like what we're talking about, you can actually go straight on there and order it. The book just came out yesterday.
Just came out yesterday.
Yep. So it's hot off the press in the US. It's had some great, fantastic reviews in the UK. So if you do like what we're talking about, you can order it right away. So Steven, I've mentioned a bit about ideas, but I'd love for you to talk about the idea of the book to our audience and introduce it to them.
Yeah, so the idea of the book is really to do with how we conceive of ideas and whether a new idea is necessarily a good one. And in the course of my work, I started collecting stories. One of the earliest things I realized was, we like Elon Musk and Tesla, electric cars are the wave of the future. I didn't know till I was researching this book that in the late 1890s, there was a fleet of electric taxis operating in Manhattan. And for a couple of decades, people thought the electric car was going to be the future 120 years ago. So that's not a new idea. And we hear a lot these days about what some people call the Silicon Valley ideology, which is everything must be new, everything must be invented out of nothing, we've got to disrupt all the old ways of thinking. But very often a new way of thinking turns out to be an old one. And one of my favorite stories about that in the history of medicine a woman who won the Nobel Prize for medicine at the end of last year, I think, is a Chinese woman called Tu Youyou, who was told, she was a scientist, and she was told by the Chinese government in the 60s to research a new malaria pill because their malaria drugs they had didn't really work. And she was part of a secret governmental science enterprise who were told to actually go back and look into the textbooks of traditional Chinese medicine to see if there'd been any clues there about a new malaria drug. And sure enough, in a 4th century textbook, she found a clue because she'd been trying to boil up an extract of sweet wormwood. And it didn't work. The extract didn't take. And she found in this textbook the idea that the old masters did not boil it. And she thought, oh, hang on. They could have boiled it if they wanted to. They had the technology to boil water back then. But they didn't. They just soaked it. And that gave her the idea. And she did the same thing. And she came out with what is now the world's major anti-malarial drug, all from that clue she found in the ancient literature. So the point of the book really, in its largest sense, is to say, we often think that the progress of science and knowledge is kind of linear progression, and we know better than anyone else from the past. Well, it turns out the people in the past knew quite a lot of good stuff, and a lot of the most cutting-edge theories in psychology and astronomy and loads of other disciplines turn out to be versions of ideas that people had thousands of years ago, even without the benefit of the internet and smartphones. So it's about also respecting the past more than we often do these days.
I absolutely love that concept. And do you think that, you mentioned Silicon Valley there, and do you feel like we're obsessed today with innovation, moving forward, the future, technological advancements? Do you almost think that the people trying to innovate are looking in the wrong places?
Absolutely. They're looking at institutions we currently have, like they want to disrupt education or disrupt things, and they're saying this is all nonsense. We've got to think of something entirely new. The problem is, again, if you have respect for the thinkers of the past, people have been thinking about these things for thousands of years. They weren't stupid. So, very often you'll find a clue in the past which will lead you to, a new version of that idea. It won't be the same thing. And this happens in all kinds of fields. For instance, cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness, these things are very fashionable nowadays. It turns out that the inventors of CBT knew that they were basically rejuvenating ancient Stoicism, which is the practice of the ancient Greeks who realized back then that, okay, you can't change what happens to you, but you can change how you think about it. And that's how you attain emotional tranquility. And that is the most clinically respectable psychological therapeutic method of the 21st century as well. So human beings haven't changed all that much. So in that sense, the best ideas won't change all that much either.
And do you think as a human being wanting to experience these things from the examples you just mentioned, we almost feel there's more authenticity and genuineness when we're using something of the past? Or do you feel, as humans at the moment, we actually want something new? Where have you seen that from your research?
I feel in the general culture we get excited about something new. We get excited about a new pop-up restaurant doing something weird with food. You know, we get excited about a new app on our phone. And very often, you know, if you have an idea that you think is a brilliant new idea, and then you come across it and you think someone had that hundreds of years ago, it's tempting to feel disappointed. But you know, one of the experts I interviewed in this book, a philosopher called Galen Strawson, I was talking to him, and he wrote a wonderful thing about that. He said, you know, sometimes I have an idea, and I find this idea was anticipated by some guy in the 17th century, and I think that's a beautiful thing. I feel that's a kind of connection of minds across the centuries, and we're all part of this common humanity throughout history. So he finds that optimistic, and also he thinks, well, if some genius had that idea before me, then there's probably something in it.
Rainey says, right now I'm working on a project I thought of years ago. I have competition, but that's okay because there's plenty for everyone. Interesting. Have you found that actually, just looking at that comment? Do you find that sometimes our ideas kind of catch up with where we are? Or?
Absolutely. I mean, I sometimes have an idea for something to write, and then, you know, I don't write it because I get distracted, and years later I find this in my notes again, and I think, oh, is it too late for that? And actually, no, it's not too late. You know, unless you're writing about, you know, Donald Trump, you know, what happened 5 minutes ago in politics. Yeah. You know, the idea that things always have to be topical is possibly a bit anti-intellectual. You know, there are things that are topical and interesting for decades, for hundreds of years, for thousands of years, and those are probably the most important things.
Can you give us some example of the best innovators? I know you write about many of them in the book as well. What are they doing differently? So how are they using ideas or wisdom or knowledge from the past to create things today?
Well, they're doing it in they're doing it in technology and science, and they're also doing it in philosophy and cosmology and these, you know, much more apparently abstract disciplines. But I talked to a cosmologist who works on things like crazy ideas like dark energy, which might not even be true, and you know, the way the universe is expanding. And he told me he's really interested in a guy called Fred Hoyle, who is this great British astronomer, who did amazing work on what goes on inside the sun. But you know, he decided the Big Bang couldn't be true. And he's the guy who called the Big Bang because he was saying, oh, there's this theory that the universe began in this like massive explosion, Big Bang, nonsense. And so Fred Hoyle these days is thought of as someone who was a bit of a failure. But in fact, he had this idea that galaxies were expanding and new materials forming to fill in the gaps instead of the Big Bang theory. And it turns out the latest theories of the inflationary universe have the same idea, just scaled up. So the universe is expanding and new galaxies are being created to fill in the gaps. So he had a right idea, but then the new cosmologists kind of look at that and think, well, he got it wrong slightly, you just need to scale it up. So often you find that these innovators, they find an old idea and there was something missing or there was something wrong with it, but they've got the new piece of the puzzle that fits in, so they can recuperate this idea and think, okay, that guy wasn't totally wrong, but he had something going, and now we know more. We can resuscitate this idea and really run with it.
What advice do you have for children or kids at school today who want to be tomorrow's innovators?
That's really interesting. I mean, read a lot of old stuff. You know, read 18th century philosophy. Read about Elon Musk. I mean, he's one of the heroes of the book because he really knows about the history of innovation, the history of technology. You know, his company is named Tesla after Nikola Tesla, you know, the late 19th century, early 20th century Serbian scientist. You know, he knows what he's doing, and, you know, the space stuff, he's very interested in the history of space exploration. So it's all about, you've got to study the past in order to go forward. You can't start from nothing. Right. And sort of, we know that to be true, of course. You've got to know your subject to be able to advance it. But still, you know, it's worth looking at discarded ideas from the past because they may turn out to be true. You know, another scientist I talked to did this very deliberately. She's a French scientist in the field of epigenetics, which basically means that things that happen to you in your lifetime, like stress or, you know, bad events, can actually affect the genome you pass down to your descendants. And this is very new science. They've only figured that this can happen in the last 10 or 20 years in rats and mice they've experimented on so far. But this, for a couple of hundred years before that, this was like, you know, this was like nonsense. This was an idea a French guy called Lamarck had, and he was a theorist of evolution even before Darwin. And he thought that animals could pass experiences down to their descendants somehow. And then Darwin came along and the science of genetics came along, and everyone thought Lamarck was just totally wrong, and his name became a kind of byword for mistakes in science. And then Isabelle Monsuy, this French scientist, she was doing her research on the mice and finding out that this really did happen. And at the same time, she was going to the National Archives and reading Lamarck's original papers and thinking to herself, as she said to me, my God, he was so right, he was so right. And he never got the credit for 200 years. But actually, he was right all along.
Absolutely phenomenal. And it's amazing because we don't hear about these stories, but you've researched them. And how were you able to find these? Like, how hard is it to find these remarkable stories from all over the world?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of work in the library, and it's also, you know, I was lucky enough to talk to a lot of really interesting scientists and philosophers and political thinkers. And so you talk to them and they give you ideas and you kind of read things, and you're kind of going down a rabbit hole when you're doing research. And I'm lucky enough to be able to work in the British Library, which has a copy of every book that's ever been published in my country. So you read something and you think, oh, that's interesting, I'll look up the footnote. And then the footnote says, I got this from like 3 other books. So you go and read those books, and then there are footnotes in those, and you know, you can spend, you know, a fortnight on like one particular subject. They're fascinating. You do a deep dive on the subject, and then it never even gets into the book, because it doesn't work in the story on that place. But I mean, it's fun. It's what I find pleasurable.
Absolutely brilliant. Were there any exciting things that didn't make into the book that you'd like to share now? Is there?
I can't actually think of any. I think I put everything into the book that I thought was good.
Okay,
yeah.
Good.
There are other things that are maybe being held over for a different project because they didn't quite fit this idea.
Yeah, awesome. So I wanted to take the audience through the book a bit, because while I was flicking through it yesterday, I loved the chapter titles.
Thank you.
And they drew me to certain thoughts. And there was one that I wanted to pick out particularly. So, well, no, there's a few actually that I wanted to pick out. One of them is all about, so chapter 8, it's actually called When Zombies Attack. And I like this because you say sometimes ideas return when they should definitely have stayed dead.
Yeah, so this is the dark side of what I'm discussing in the book.
Yeah.
I'm discussing, you know, ideas coming back, but sometimes they really shouldn't come back. And, you know, I didn't know before I started writing that chapter, a lot of people right now think the Earth is flat. You know, and you think, that's insane. Surely we've all known the Earth is flat for, well, people assume people thought the world was flat before Columbus sailed, but actually they knew in ancient Greece that the Earth was spherical because of the way shadows are cast in different places and because of the shadow the Earth casts on the moon, all this. Everyone knew the Earth was spherical. And yet now there are all these amazing conspiracy theories on the internet about how the world is really flat and the stars are all holograms, and of course it encompasses the conspiracy theory that the moon landings were faked. And the idea is that the world is ringed by this massive wall of ice. I mean, I'm visualizing Game of Thrones, but going all round the disk of the planet. And that's what we are told is the continent of Antarctica. So that's why things don't fall off the edge. And you know, this theory is just amazing and strange. And you think it's a kind of sign of how we don't really trust, you know, old science because, you know, it's been established that the world is spherical for ages. And that we, you know, on the internet you can say anything and you can put together a kind of video on YouTube and a certain amount of people will believe it. So these are things I call zombie ideas. They come back, but they're dead and they really should have stayed dead. And, you know, there's an economist who's written a whole book about zombie ideas in economics because since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, it's obviously true that many of the precepts of economics, like markets are always efficient, you know, crashes won't happen, those ideas are nonsense. But they're still being taught as Econ 101 in universities across the country. So, you know, these are zombies as well. So it turns out it's very hard to kill zombies. And, you know, what you've got to teach critical thinking, I think, is a critical, that's, you know, something I would give advice to children or maybe to their parents or to their teachers. You know, people have got to learn the skill of evaluating evidence for themselves and evaluating arguments and seeing, well, how is it likely that that chain of reasoning is really true? What's the evidence? What are the sources for these claims? And that's what people who just think the Earth is flat because they've seen it on the internet are not doing. They're not taking that further step for themselves.
Definitely, and that couldn't be more true today. The current conversation is all around whether Facebook switch the conversation over around the voting and political stance on Trump, etc., and whether the stories that came on Facebook are true or false.
Sure.
And how that switched it. So how do you feel people grow from assimilating, evaluating, and then coming to sound conclusions versus being lost in that assimilation bubble and never coming to any conclusions?
It's very difficult. I mean, it's one of the big problems of our age. You know, we have these things that people call filter bubbles. You know, certainly my Twitter timeline is, you know, pretty much full of people like me. I don't remember seeing anybody that I follow on Twitter saying that Brexit was a great idea.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
you know, saying that they thought Donald Trump would be a better president than Hillary Clinton. But I know there are people who aren't stupid who do believe those things. So you know, you should, you know, to an extent, you should go out and try and find other points of view. But you can't blame any one company. You can't blame Facebook. You can't blame Twitter, because it's up to each of us to actually go out into the wilds of the internet and do our own research and settle questions for ourselves. And if someone's just reading one thing on Facebook or Twitter and just being convinced by that, that's kind of their fault.
Completely, I completely agree with you, and I love that. We need to take responsibility for what we see, what we curate, and what we're absorbing information-wise. I like this question that you asked. You said, when do new circumstances require old thinking? Mm-hmm. And I was really thinking about that. When do you feel it is that we actually wake up a bit and go, actually, maybe I should look in the past, maybe I should research? Are there certain things that...
Yeah, well, the story that opens that chapter is, you know, the American war in Afghanistan. You know, the US goes into Afghanistan in 2001 because the Taliban won't hand over bin Laden. And, you know, they've got laser-guided bombs, and they've got all the most modern equipment, and it turns out the crucial factor in that war was cavalry. You know, they're going into the 21st century, they're invading this rugged mountainous country, and the best way to get around still is on horseback. So, you know, the US Special Forces soldiers have to take a crash course in horsemanship to get around. And then they're actually riding on horseback along with, you know, their allies in the country on cavalry charges against Taliban positions who have got old Soviet tanks. It's an extraordinary picture. And then this turns out to be true in other areas as well. I talk about chess. You know, the World Chess Championship is happening right now in New York. I'm very excited about that. Magnus Carlsen is playing Karyakin down at the South Street Seaport. And very often in chess, if you're preparing against an opponent, you go back into the history of chess and you look at opening variations from 30, 50 years ago that are unfashionable, that nobody plays anymore, and that people assume are bad. And you can go back and you can reinvent that idea and add a new move and surprise your opponent. And this is what Kramnik did against Kasparov when he won the World Championship in 2000. And this happens in politics as well. There's a chapter about political ideas, which is, I hope, quite topical now again, because we think there are all these new ideas coming along, like maybe some of the audience have heard of this idea of universal basic income. Yes. People are really starting to talk about that now, especially even the entrepreneurs of Silicon Valley are saying, well, you know, they're feeling a bit guilty because all the automation and all the robots, they're saying, they're going to destroy all the jobs. You know, we're going to take all the jobs away from people with computers, so what are people going to do? And they're saying, wouldn't it be good if we just gave everybody a basic income for free? You know, enough to live on for free as your kind of birthright. And this also is a very old idea. You know, maybe they haven't researched it, but this was first proposed in the late 18th century. So that idea is coming back, even though it's coming back now, but for entirely different reasons. Because, you know, back in the 18th century, they didn't think robots were going to steal all the jobs. But this is the new motivation for this old idea. And, you know, currently people who might be unhappy with the election either way, or just unhappy about anything politically right now, you know, one idea that I think really should come back, that I'm a big fan of, is this political idea called sortition. Now, we all love democracy, and we think democracy is a brilliant thing, but we all know that democracy is corrupted, or at least compromised in various ways. You know, there are lobbyists, there's lots of money involved, people are always seeking to get re-elected, so they're thinking short term. Well, it turns out the Athenians thought of this 2,000 years ago. So for, I think, 3 branches of their government, they used a system which didn't involve elections. It was just a lottery, a random lottery. You got picked, like the draft. Yeah. You got picked, excuse me, to serve a fixed term as the leader of this branch of government, along with some of your random fellow ordinary citizens, and that's how it worked. And, you know, you think of that idea immediately and you think, well, how would that work? I mean, these people wouldn't be experts, they wouldn't just be some average Joe off the streets. Yeah, sure. But how if you're accused of a serious crime, how do we decide whether you're innocent or guilty? We use a jury, and that's the same principle. 12 people picked at random. We trust that 12 citizens picked at random, they won't all be idiots. You know, maybe there'll be a couple of idiots, but we trust that, you know, human reason overall will come to the right conclusions. And there are a couple of political philosophers working away in quite obscure corners of the discipline right now who are saying, let's bring back this idea of like a jury government. You know, maybe you'd have a couple of hundred people, you know, you can work out the details, and they'd be advised by, you know, branches of the civil service who really were expert in certain things, but essentially they'd take a kind of jury vote over important decisions. And the idea is that would reflect the will of the people much better than the system we currently have.
That's really interesting. I was going to ask you about political systems and the past advice, so I'm really glad you went into that space. I mean, in one sense, politics is the area that hasn't been disrupted, or in one sense, has just been disrupted in the way that you look at it. Do you actually feel that certain businesses, I feel business is a space that is taking on concepts of the past, themes of the past, but do you think politics will ever go there?
The trouble with politics is that its institutions are already so old, we think they're inevitable. This is what's really interesting to think about these ideas like sortition and jury governments, because we assume that democracy means elections. It doesn't necessarily. Elections are one way to do democracy, but if you think of what democracy fundamentally means, it just means the rule of the people, and the people can rule by other means. But of course, turkeys won't vote for Christmas, so you won't find elected politicians saying, let's destroy the system of election. Yeah. So it has to come, you know, from some sort of grassroots movement, you know, but there's no reason to think that it wouldn't. I mean, these things do happen in countries around the world.
Completely. Is there a way that I may use your insights and knowledge in my daily life?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, I find that one of my chapters is called Placebo Ideas, and I found out things that are really surprising to me and really useful in terms of thinking about one's own thinking. We all know that the placebo effect in medicine is pretty strong. You can give people a sugar pill and it can be as powerful as 6 milligrams of morphine if they think they're getting morphine. Ideas can work like that too. And you know, again, in the modern age, we're worried that things have to be new. We're also worried about facts, and we're worried about truth for very good reasons, because we don't want a zombie idea to come back. We want an idea to be accurate. But it turns out there are a lot of ideas that doesn't really matter whether they're true or not, if they work for you some other way. So one example of this is the idea that alcoholism is a disease. Now, this is quite controversial within the medical community. Some people say, yeah, alcoholism is a disease. Other people say, well, it's people self-medicating for some other kind of underlying problem. But whatever the truth is, it turns out that the idea that alcoholism is a disease is a thing that really helps people with alcoholism. Because, you know, otherwise people will say, well, you just have no willpower, you know, why don't you just pull yourself together? And if they're able to say, well, look, now I have a disease, so I can seek treatment, then that helps them feel better, and you know, helps them feel better about themselves, and probably make them, you know, get better in the end. And there are other ideas that can be placebos as well. For example, the idea that we have free will. We often don't question, you know. So of course we have free will. I choose what to do. I can choose to pick up my glass of water or not. But then, you know, for a couple of hundred years, people have pointed out, well, if we live in a mechanistic universe that's all cause and effect, and if we don't believe we have souls, so a lot of people still do believe we have souls, but if you don't, if you're a kind of science-based person, you think we don't have souls, we're just organisms, it's all atoms and particle physics happening, then, you know, we're just machines, you know, just like any other machine. So we don't really have free will. What we do is just determined by the environment and what's going on within our bodies and what's going on in the external world. But it turns out they've done some very interesting psychological experiments. If you convince people that they don't have free will in this way, then people will do bad things. Yes. They will act more unethically.
Incredible.
Whereas if you let people believe that they do have free will, then, you know, they'll be nice. So it's probably better for us to believe we have free will even if we don't. So it's a placebo for us individually. It's also a placebo for society, because if the whole of society thought nobody had free will, then it would probably, you know, go up in flames.
Yeah, completely.
So, and you can think about your own thoughts like that. You can think about that, and this goes back to the message of CBT. If you're kind of anxious or sort of angry about something, you can kind of step back and think, well, it doesn't matter if I should be angry or if what I'm angry about is true or not. Is this anger helping me? Think if it's not helping me, no, I'll just discard it. And this goes back to ancient Stoicism as well. So this idea of thinking about ideas in a more complicated way than just true or false or new or old, that's one of the main messages of the book.
That's quite a mature and forward way of thinking, actually, because I think a lot of people, like you said, are so thrown into the facts and the details that we almost miss these principles that could actually help us grow or be better.
Sure, and I try to be careful to say, this isn't just like relativism and anything goes, because I still want to say, no, it's rubbish to say the Earth is flat. We just know that it isn't.
Yeah.
But, there are questions that are, more psychological and more complex and ambiguous than questions about whether the Earth is flat.
Completely.
And questions about how our minds work and how we approach the world and how we live within the world. Those can't really be decided, 100% one way or the other. So, but this is also true in hardcore physical science. There's a Nobel Prize-winning physicist called Frank Wilczek, who talks about truthifiability. Stephen Colbert talks about truthiness as a criticism of the Republican Party's approach to things. But no, Frank Wilczek says, if you've got a new scientific idea in theoretical physics, don't worry about whether it's really true or not right now. Think about whether it's truthifiable. And by that he means, it could just be a placebo idea in science. It might lead to more interesting research. It might give us more ideas in the future. It might be fertile. But if you're too hasty to judge it and decide it's not true, then you won't go on that journey and maybe discover something else down the line. So it's about holding things in balance and not being too quick to sort of say true or false or to dismiss things, because things can come back. Everything can be fertile grounds for the next idea.
I was thinking about what you just mentioned. You speak about in the book, actually, that making mistakes, you talk about actually getting it wrong, is okay. As in, because I think there's been a lot of worry, especially around election time here. All the polls realized they were wrong. Lots of media outlets realized they were wrong. They were wrong in the sense of they predicted a Hillary win, and they got it wrong. But tell us more about failure and growing from that.
Well, I mean, being wrong is bad if history then stops and nothing else ever happens and the last thing you ever did was be wrong. But of course, that's not how the world works, and that's not how life works. And, a lot of science comes from being wrong. It goes back to Frank Wilczek saying, you might have a wrong idea that's truthifiable. And another guy, this cosmologist I was talking to, he's investigating this idea called dark energy. And people have probably heard about this. There's dark matter and dark energy. But these are kind of totally theoretical constructs. That's why they're called dark, because nobody's ever seen them. Nobody knows how to measure them. But from the observations we're making, we think there must be these weird forms of energy, because otherwise we can't make the maths add up. Now, this guy at University College London, he's a cutting-edge cosmologist. He told me, I think dark energy might just be nonsense. I think it might be wrong. But it's the only game in town at the moment, so we're working on it and trying to make it work, because it might be the only stepping stone we have to a better theory in the future. So he might be wrong right now, because everybody might be wrong right now. But that's the sort of funnel you have to go through to come out the other side and have better ideas, because it's only in kind of understanding how that might be wrong that you might get to the truth later on. So, being wrong and being right are not forever things. They're always part of a process. So if you're a pollster who's worried that you were wrong about, your election prediction, I feel sorry for those guys, but all that means is they can, look at their mistakes and they'll do much better next time. So we're all on that path of personal growth in our intellectual lives and our lives in general. So, people shouldn't feel too bad about themselves.
Ryan asks, what old ideas can you reflect on in terms of happiness or a life lived well? What can our ancestors' history teach us on happiness?
I mean, that goes back, it's a good question. It goes back again to Stoicism and, even more ancient philosophies than that. The idea is Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, these guys in the ancient Roman and Greek world, they thought very carefully about this. And something bad might happen to you, and, you can't change that. But you can change how you think about it, and it turns out that the way you think about something affects the way you feel about it. And, there are all kinds of all these theories come together. The 19th century American psychologist William James also said that, emotion is kind of an unconscious inference that you're making from observing your bodily states and what your thoughts are. And you can control emotion with thinking. And this is what people say now in terms of cognitive behavioral therapy. And these things are very ancient. And each age kind of seems to rediscover this idea and couch it differently. When I was researching this idea, there was a guy called Émile Coué, who was a French pharmacist, who, a very popular pharmacist, and working in a little village in France. And people used to come with him with all kinds of ailments. And he found out that when he gave them a bottle of just some kind of nonsense liquid, medicine wasn't very advanced. But if he put on the label a sort of happy message, he found that the patients got got better more quickly. So he was using the power of suggestion. And then he wrote a book. He became a best-selling author in America through a book called The Power of Conscious Auto-Suggestion. And this is all about changing your habits of thinking. Because if you find that bad thoughts come to you, negative thoughts kind of automatically come to you, so you can change that. Because those are like bad nails in a plank of wood. You just have to deliberately get into the habit of thinking different thoughts every time one of those crops up. And then you can hammer those bad nails out and put good nails in and just change the way you actually habitually think. And this is the key to happiness. And of course, that was a Stoical idea as well. So, this is a kind of truth that's rediscovered again and again through the ages. And now we're couching it in terms of cognition and stuff like that. But, they knew about it thousands of years ago. So this is something, if I had to bet on anything that was, absolutely true in terms of helping people feel better about their own lives, I would suggest, that idea that I talk about in the book is it's what all the great people throughout history have come to the same idea, so there really must be something to it.
Yeah, definitely. I remember when I was living as a monk, one of the analogies or ways in which we were taught that was between seeds and weeds. So planting seeds or weeds. So it said that our negative thoughts are like weeds.
Right.
They look like seeds at the start, they look like plants, but actually they're weeds. They're like destroying the plant that we're trying to grow of happiness or fulfillment or satisfaction. And we should replace them with planting positive seeds.
That's a really nice image, yeah. And that's similar to the distinction between bad nails and good nails.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, it's all the same idea. It's beautiful, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. It's poetic. And I think sometimes, because things are poetic, we almost shun them away because they have this sort of...
Of course, because you think, oh, well, it's kind of new age, hippie wisdom.
New age, exactly.
So in a way, we probably need it redescribed to us in modern scientific parlance, through clinical psychology right now, in order to kind of realize its truth, because we don't trust those old imagistic, analogical ways of describing things. But they're all saying the same thing. That's what's fascinating.
Now, I hadn't warned Stephen about this, but as we always do with our authors when they're here on Follow the Reader, we have an on-the-spot session where I ask you a bunch of quick-fire questions, which you'll have to answer, which I think you'll be brilliant at. So, Stephen, we're going to play a quick word association game. And I'd like you to think of the first word that comes to your mind when you hear these words. They're quite simple for you, I'm pretty sure. So the first word is innovation.
Computers.
London.
Shard.
New York City.
East Village.
Technology.
Smartphones.
Tesla.
Motors.
Driverless cars.
Robots.
The future.
Brilliant.
The past.
Amazing.
Evan Spiegel, founder of Snapchat.
Pictures.
Brilliant. Okay, your best idea inspired by the past.
My best idea inspired by the past really is to write this book. I mean, maybe that's a cop-out.
No, it's fine. It's absolutely fine. And the best invention of all time in your ideas?
Best invention of all time has got to be beer.
Okay, nice. Good. Big shout out to all the beer companies out there. There we go. Anyone in particular?
Anyone wants to send me free beer, I'm all about it.
Any brands?
No, it doesn't matter. Any beer.
No, anything.
I'll taste
all
anything.
the brands out there. Brilliant. The best idea, not that you had, just the best idea that you thought, that you heard of when you heard of it, you thought, wow, that's amazing, but that never worked.
Well, the best idea, one of the best ideas in my book that didn't work for like a millennium and a half, but was true, was the idea that everything's made of atoms.
Wow.
So this guy Democritus in ancient Greece, again, he just thought about things very carefully. It was like sitting back, he thought, you know what, puddles evaporate, what's going on there? And he thought, my servant brings a loaf of bread into my room, but I can smell the bread before the bread is in my hands. What's going on there? And he figured out there must be atoms of bread traveling through the air into his nose. Everything must be made of indivisible particles and empty spaces between them. This was an extraordinary idea and revolutionary at the time. And Aristotle said, nonsense, it can't be like that. And so that idea was shut down for 1,500 years until the Renaissance, when people started looking at it again. And the reason we still have things called atoms is because that's a Greek word meaning you can't cut it. And the chemists who actually discovered atoms in the 17th century named them atoms in honor of this Greek guy who'd had this idea so long ago, who was just dismissed and kind of lay in obscurity until he finally got his vindication so long later.
Unbelievable. That's a long time to wait, and you never found out. So he died believing that no one agreed with him.
Exactly, yeah.
Wow, what a way. So that was your answer to the best idea that never worked, or well, did work, but wasn't believed while he was alive. The worst idea that worked.
The worst idea that works. I'm going to say flat Earth theories, so as not
Okay.
to be too controversial.
Yeah, absolutely fine. And if you had the choice, would you read books or listen to audiobooks?
I would read books because I'm a print junkie, and
Me too.
also I can read quicker than I can listen, so I
Yeah.
can just read more if I'm reading books.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you. So answer this by finishing off the sentence. When I get up in the morning,
Make coffee.
my favorite app is?
Podcast addict
Okay. My biggest inspiration
is music.
one philosopher that I'm really happy I read about or read work from.
Galen Strawson, who I talk to in my book, he's brilliant.
One book that I can't live without.
The Complete Shakespeare.
Okay, fantastic. These are great recommendations for you guys. If you're watching at home or at work, wherever you are, these are the answers to all your questions.
Also the Oxford English Dictionary, can't live without that either.
Definitely. And here we go. What advice, if any, would you have for Mark Zuckerberg?
Mark Zuckerberg doesn't really need my advice, but I would say, didn't he start up a book club?
Yes, he did. Yeah.
Is that still going?
I don't think he kept it up. I read it for a
Yeah.
year. Yeah, I followed it.
My
for
advice
a
would
year.
be like, start your book club up again and just read more books. And it could be my book, doesn't have to be, that would be great. But read more books, encourage people to read more books because you have such a platform and such a position of power. And I think the world would be better if everyone read more books. Again, not necessarily mine, but that would be brilliant. But reading books is cool.
Definitely. My producer took me to Strand Bookstore just round the corner.
Oh, I love that place, yeah.
Yeah, she took me there yesterday, and one of the hats on it said, "Make America Read Again." And I thought that was very, very timely.
We should
and
all
interesting.
adopt that slogan.
Yeah, definitely. Any advice you'd have for Elon Musk, or what advice would you ask for from Elon Musk?
I mean, I'd ask, like, if I move to Mars,
Yeah.
when he's colonised Mars, is it going to be nice, or are we just going to be living in sort of greenhouse bubbles? And is it going to be just kind of like living underground on planet Earth and never really feeling the sun on your face? I mean, maybe he wants to terraform it eventually, but certainly for a few centuries, it's not going to be very pleasant living on Mars. So I would ask him, if I had to go there, I mean, how would I be happy?
Definitely, fantastic. What's the best advice you've ever received?
Best advice I've ever received is, you can, which is from my dad actually, is if you want to find out about something, you can find out about it yourself. You can, I'm not going to tell you, here are some books, you know where the library is, go and find out about it.
Absolutely. And what's the best advice you've ever given?
I'm not sure I've ever given any good advice, so I wouldn't presume to say.
Well, we love your humility, thank you.
Thanks.
We're glad. And the advice you'd give to your younger self?
The advice I give to my younger self would be like, don't worry, it's all going to be fine.
Awesome. Finish off the sentence. I wish I could be more...
Athletic.
If I could learn one thing, it would be?
How to play the cello.
And a technology I can't wait to be released, or a technology that you wish is going to happen in your lifetime?
Flying cars. Where are our flying cars? We were promised them in the 50s. What's up with that?
Unbelievable. Thank you so much. That was brilliant. I think you did amazingly well. Stephen, it's been fantastic speaking to you today.
Thank you very much for having me.
I think I could actually sit with you and speak with you for hours, if not days.
Absolutely.
Just as in times. Is there anything that we haven't touched on in your book or from your work that you really wanted to share with the audience, or you feel are like really great stories that we've missed out?
We've covered an awful lot, but I mean, I mentioned earlier that, the idea is like to not rush to judgment.
Yeah.
And this turns out to be like one of the conclusions of the book. And again, there was a guy from thousands of years ago who had this idea, a guy called Pirro, who, started off as a painter, and he painted some paintings in the gymnasium of like horse races and stuff. He wasn't a very good painter. So then he went traveling, and he had his one big idea, which came to be known as skepticism. Now, we use the idea, skepticism these days, to mean something a bit crabby, a bit negative. Also, we have this idea that climate change skeptics are people who are they're not really skeptical, they're credulous because they believe any old nonsense posted by one guy on the internet as against the vast consensus of all the scientists on the planet. But skepticism, as originally devised, was saying, we can never arrive at the ultimate truth about something. We're flawed human beings. So rather than being certain about things, we should always suspend our belief, suspend our judgment, because things we think are false might turn out to be true, things we think are true might turn out to be false. And that way we can have a more fulfilling and enriching experience. And that's what Pirro thought. And that turns out to be what a guy who wrote a manual on CIA intelligence analysis thinks as well. It's amazing how all these ideas are found in totally different places. And so it's how I conclude the book as well. We've seen all ideas come back from history, being upgraded or being rediscovered. People thought they were false for hundreds of years and were completely certain about that. There are probably things we are completely certain are true right now, but people in 400 years are going to discover are false. So let's be humble and let's suspend our belief. And that way lies a more interesting mental experience and a more interesting experience of the world.
Absolutely. Don't rush to judge and be humble. What beautiful messages and a way
You've summed it up better than I could.
No, just grabbing the things that stood out to me. Thank you so much, Stephen, again.
Thank you
for
very
being in
much.
the studio with us, and we hope to have you again, actually.
I'd love to.
Yeah, brilliant. Take care, guys. See you soon.